Good afternoon, and many thanks, first of all, to the organizers for inviting the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to participate in this very important civil society initiative to prevent violent extremism. As was said, I'll try to be brief and try to put in 10 minutes, basically, in a nutshell, the key elements of the Secretary General's plan of action to prevent violent extremism, but then really to focus also on the best practices and obviously the lessons learned on preventing violent extremism as identified by the High Commissioner for Human Rights in a recent report to the Human Rights Council. So on the first part, the Secretary General's plan of action, as you know, was launched just a year ago in January 2016 and is obviously the result of a long consultation process. At the outset of the Secretary General's plan of action, it also specifies very clearly that this is neither a new nor an exclusive phenomenon to any region, nationality, or system of belief. This was obviously already mentioned at several occasions during the discussions today, but I think it's really important to emphasize that at the outset, also in the Secretary General's plan of action, it's clear that we're not just talking about one region or one religion alone. Yes, there are specific examples also at the outset of the report, referring to ISIL, to Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, but also to flag that the only specific individual example that comes also in the same Secretary General Plan of Action is the case of Anders Breivik, who, as you know, killed 77 people in Norway in 2011, and is clearly then showing that it's not just one region and one religion as a problem. Overall, in the Secretary General's Plan of Action, you will also see that there are more than 50 references to human rights, and not just in one chapter, isolated, but it's really mainstreamed throughout the whole Plan of Action. And I think this is really important to know, that it's really permeating the whole Plan of Action, that whatever you do needs to be abiding with international human rights law. And again, another discussion that crops up every time and again during today's debate is the question of definitions. Here, the Secretary General, while saying that this is in the prerogative of member states, but in the same sentence he clearly says, again, any of these definitions and measures must be consistent with the member states' obligations under international law, in particular international human rights law. And in the same vein, he also says that there is a risk of conflation between terrorism on the one hand side and violent extremism on the other hand side, especially if there's a broad application of counterterrorism measures, which then may eventually creep into also preventing violent extremism measures. Then the Secretary General's Plan of Action is also very clear in putting it in the context of the global counterterrorism strategy, and actually also explaining that the pillars 1 and 4, which is basically the conditions conducive to terrorism and the human rights dimension of counterterrorism, need to be reinforced. So in that sense, there is a link between counterterrorism and PVE, because the conditions conducive to terrorism need to be tackled anyway, and this has been agreed since 2006 in the Global Counterterrorism Strategy, and also reviewed last July in the 10-year review. So the creation of open, equitable, inclusive, and pluralist societies based on the full respect of human rights and with economic opportunities for all, that's a quote from the SG's Plan of Action, is basically the most promising strategy for rendering the appeal of violent extremists unattractive. Then in the second chapter, the SG Plan of Action goes into the impact of violent extremism, essentially focusing on the various pillars of the United Nations: peace and security, sustainable development, human rights, and humanitarian action. And then the subsequent section is very interesting also for what you have been discussing so far, namely the context and drivers of violent extremism. And here, something also which I see taken up in your draft declaration, the distinction between push factors and pull factors. So the push factors are the conditions conducive to violent extremism and the structural context from which it emerges, so basically pushing people into violent extremism, whereas the pull factors, on the other hand side, are the individual motivations and processes which play a key role in transforming ideas and grievances into violent extremist action. And here, you have already alluded to them: lack of social economic opportunities, marginalization, discrimination, poor governance, violations of human rights and rule of law, prolonged unresolved conflicts, and radicalization in prisons are among the key push factors. At the same time, you have also the pull factors, which may really be very largely dependent on the individual backgrounds and motives and motivations, but also collective grievances and victimizations of whole communities. Again, there may be also a misuse of beliefs and political ideologies and ethnical cultural differences. The core part, I would say, is basically in the SG Plan of Action, the agenda of action with recommendations very concretely on how to prevent violent extremism. And here the Secretary General proposes setting a policy framework, a global framework to prevent violent extremism. In that context, what is really important to understand is that the national and regional action plans, in the SG Plan of Action, it's mainly directed towards member states, but there's a specific reference, obviously, also to NGO activities. Youth, families, women, religious, cultural, educational leaders, and civil society organizations are explicitly mentioned several times. And then there are seven areas where action should be taken, and I'll basically, also for the sake of time, I'll focus on three specifically, which have also been identified as the core in the High Commissioner's report last September to the Human Rights Council on best practices and lessons learned. Here, basically, the first point is, as we already briefly discussed, the definitional question. Is it violent extremism? How to define this in the first place? There's a multitude of national, domestic attempts of defining it, but then also some of the domestic efforts go basically to extremism as such, so they deliberately drop the violent element, which is also very much criticized in the High Commissioner's report. Because if it's not limited to violent extremism, any such measures risk targeting the holding of an opinion or belief rather than the actual conduct. And this is obviously in contrast to the international legal framework, which provides a very positive and heavy protection to holding beliefs and to having opinions which cannot basically be interfered by the states as such. Then in terms of the do's and don'ts, I would say, so it's basically the lessons learned and also the lessons to be learned. In terms of community engagement and empowerment, there obviously any pre-existing relationship between the authorities and the communities is vital. If at a late stage, basically, police or security officials come in and interact in an insensitive manner or have, for example, racial or religious profiling, then this can be really counterproductive and also counter human rights. Religious leaders obviously have an important role to play, but at the same time, it also needs to be very gender sensitive. So if there's an overemphasis on religious leaders who in their majority tend to be male, that may also backfire badly on gender equality. And what we have also seen, again, as a bad practice, is that sometimes the funding is channeled exclusively to the presumably most at-risk people, which seem to be the boys and the young men, which then inadvertently or indirectly may divert the money away from other, perhaps equally or even more important initiatives supporting gender equality. So in that sense, again, the involvement of women and of the grassroots is vital. Then, in terms of youth engagement, again, the most effective programs are peer-driven and should be basically developing life skills and conflict management rather than a top-down approach. And also to note that last November, the very first Forum on Human Rights, Democracy and Rule of Law focused on the widening of democratic space and specifically the role of youth in public decision-making. So there were also quite a number of very concise and implementable recommendations emanating from this Forum on Human Rights, Democracy and Rule of Law. And then finally, preventing and countering violent extremism online has also its own challenges. Obviously, there may be content that falls foul of, for example, incitement to hatred and even must be curtailed. But there, it's really important to understand the precise threshold, and here the Rabat Plan of Action on the prohibition of incitement to hatred gives clear guidance of where basically the demarcation line lies between free speech and hate speech. So if you have any, if you want to look into further details, the UN report is available on our website at ohchr.org, and I'm looking forward to any questions and the discussion afterwards. Many thanks.